This is the marathon part of the conference. We're very excited to share next now the work of the teams that participated in ACAW 2021. As I described early on, each team was invited through a call out and a ability to sort of make the engagement. It is a 6-month engagement and really requires a certain amount of commitment from the firm to provide employee time as well as guidance towards creating this work. At the same time, from Boston Valley Terracotta, the commitment to produce the prototypes and then through the process of just designing and refining the prototypes. So with that, I'm very excited to present the prototypes and research of the teams for this year. There are 2 panels that we've organized, and the projects are quite varied, but they're around certain similar themes. So the first panel has certain themes that sort of intersect with each other, and then the second panel does as well. The themes are many, but they move between things like surface effects to questions of biophilia, concerns with geology, systems and arrays, and how they may be represented. And again, which is always an interesting component within ACAW, the desire to sort of explore the potential structural applications of this rather brittle material. So each team, except for the academic teams, consisted of architects and engineers. And this is, I think, another important part of ACAW. We find it is a very collaborative process. And as I think Todd and Billy were bringing up, that the whole process here is to inform each other's expertise with new information, and through that process, develop work that would otherwise be impossible to do on one's own, or for that matter, within another kind of venue where this kind of free exchange of information and ideas would not be possible. And that is one thing that we hold very dearly to this process, that the free exchange of ideas is very important, which we do try to bring together at the end with the books that I did sort of display get compiled. And so that more than just the teams, we begin to share that with the larger public. So the first group will have our Todd Williams, Billie Tsien partners. They work with Walter P. Moore. The second group will be Cook Fox, working with Bureau Happold. Third group, Goody Clancy, working with SGH. And then we'll close with an academic group of students working with a faculty member from Carnegie Mellon University. So with that, I'd like to invite the TWBTA team so that they can share their screen.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you. All right, can you all see my screen?
Looks good, John.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Omar, for the introduction. So I just wanted to give you all a sense of where we started. First, we are essentially a team of 4 from our office, myself, Alex Odom, who's here, and then Dan Chittick to my left, and Isaac, who's dealing with some issues at home, but he's, I believe, remote. And I agree, yeah, this was a big commitment, much larger than any of us has expected, but so happy with the outcome. We came at this in a very sort of different angle. This is an image of our office at Gainsborough Studios in Manhattan. And Boston Valley happened to be doing some restoration work to the terracotta, including the bust is sort of at the center, a bust of Gainsborough himself, Thomas Gainsborough, an artist. And it was kind of an interesting way to, I'd actually reached out to Boston Valley to see if they would do a presentation on the restoration, really personally having no clue about what terracotta is and can do. And so they gracefully accepted and did a kind of remote lunch and learn at the beginning of the pandemic. And then Boston Valley and ACAW invited us to join as part of the teams to develop some prototypes. Our mission statement really was about trying to, in essence, kind of a rejection of the sort of manufactured terracotta we see a lot of today, but trying to find a way into terracotta that really is about texture and glazing, and as a way to try to explore something that's much more variegated rather than extruded. We had our approach really wasn't about wasn't really an engineering approach ultimately, although we worked with Eric Verboon at Walter P. Moore's office, who gave us some very important insight into how our structure could be assembled. But Andy Brayman was at the Matter Factory was really key in helping us explore texture and color in the terracotta as an iterative process, and he was just tireless and so incremental or important to the process for us. So thank you, Andy. So I'll begin by saying that we really started try to understand what terracotta can do. These are just some initial images of things that we are interested in that Todd and Billy pulled out as a kind of an idea of texture and color. And then a few of us have kids and Play-Doh at the ready, and started the process on our own, just looking at texture. Alex went further with a series of cast plaster studies, and then some cast plaster studies using sort of sewn leather, which ultimately later in the process becomes abstracted through Andy's help, and is actually lands as part of the prototype. And so these are, this is an image of a few images of some of Andy's first studies as abstractions of things that we had been thinking about, and perhaps things that he's thinking about. The first one is the kind of something we call the sort of cigar or series of indentations, linear indentations, then abstracted in the second image, which is kind of the next step from the leather texture or the leather patterning that Alex worked on, and then a dimple structure, and ultimately a kind of a hammered structure. And then just a series of other ideas of assembling clay, and then also putting saran wrap over the top of clay. That's something that Andy was working on to kind of create another sort of a leather texture. And then the hammer texture begins, is a series of, I mean, this is 3 different patterns or sizes of indentations, and then overlapping scales, and the tools Andy used to make these things as well. And then cast positive, and then ultimately one of the first stabs at a slab prior to firing. But the other thing that Andy was working on with us too is taking some of these patterns, some of these textures, and then applying glazes to them, and sometimes the same material with a different glaze, a different technique. He's working with us with engobes, and then oversprays, some fired overspray images. And then the kind of assembly of palettes of the same techniques for glaze, and overspray on different textures. Here with a kind of a pewter color, and then with the green that we were looking at initially. And then just the sort of, this is something that, is the surprise, the sort of ethereal quality of some of the textures that were derived from the pooling and firing process, that really sort of just opened up the work for us and made us incredibly excited. This is one of the first firings of the depression or the hammered texture. But we, as an office, sort of were searching for a way to apply it. And in our mission statement, we were thinking about facades and looking at scale and panelizing, as we did sort of on the barns, and running sort of mega textures through as sort of striations and lines as the panels pass from floor to floor. Thinking about sort of dual surfaces or surfaces that have like a primary surface and then a recessed surface, pointing corners, how to really understand how to deal with terracotta as a facade material and how it gets hung onto a facade and works through various transitions. But I think we found like we were hitting a bit of a dead end, and we do have a project in the office that has a canopy, and the canopies are sort of prevalent in our work, as Todd and Billy alluded to as well. The top right picture is an image of a canopy in India, and then the one on the bottom is from Prospect Park that Todd and Billy showed before us. But this canopy we're talking about is on the waterfront. It's a primary sketch from Todd, sort of describing the canopy and the landscape around it. And we began to think about how this canopy could reflect both the sky and the water around it. And Isaac had this thought of taking a Japanese garden, RNG garden in Kyoto, and sort of inverting the ground plane but onto the ceiling so that you have pools of sort of vibrant texture in a field. And so on this elliptical canopy we're working on, we thought we could do that by creating these sort of pools. This is a montage of various textures that Andy worked on with us as a kind of first stab as an idea of these fields in a larger field of terracotta. But the canopy ultimately would have a series of supporting columns and boxes underneath it. And so we sort of abstracted that idea to creating three different surfaces. One is a kind of edge or soffit, a fascia surface, excuse me. One, a hexagonal blue underside, which is our sort of major field. And then vertical surfaces, which would have these sort of vertical striations that we saw flash up a little bit before. And so in purple and blue, and then orange, those three surfaces, the soffit, the underside has a hexagonal blue, and then the vertical surfaces. And we began thinking about those textures and colors as an underside, and although very vibrant and deep, when in the light, they sort of lose their qualities when inverted, and we were a little nervous that this would not work, even in an exterior application where you have reflecting water. They may not be as luminous as we had hoped. So Andy sort of re-enters the picture, although really never left or skipped a beat, and began looking at brighter hues and lighter colors and textures, and ultimately landed with this blue texture as the sort of primary underside for the canopy. And then the striation patterns, which would be vertical, would remain the same. And then this sort of leathery pattern would also remain, although we would transform the color slightly into a blue hue for the soffit. So these are the three textures that we developed, and then began looking at just the scale of both the hammered texture and the scale of the tile for the undersides, just to kind of see what matched. And it was a discussion of both scale and how that scale meets is met by the texture as well, and then how varied that texture would be. The interesting about the hexagon is that it could be rotated in 6 different ways, so we could avoid the repeat that is kind of shows up more on the right image here. You know, in a sense, it was agnostic to its orientation. You could do whatever you wanted to in order to kind of catch the light in a different way, or avoid a repeat that was inevitable. And Eric Verboen began to discuss with us how we might hang the panels in a series, both to kind of make the alignments easier, but also the erection process more quick. Although the scale of our mock-up won't be this size, but in practical terms, for installing this on a large canopy, this sort of system would need to be employed. And to complicate things a little bit more, we were trying to find a way to place this in our office, which is covered with models of projects current and past, and also mock-up as well. And we wanted to find a home for it. So right in front of Todd's desk here, we've located and further abstracted it from the orientation of the pieces in order to make it fit. This is the model we received from Boston Valley as a way to indicate how the pieces would go together, both as a display object, but then also be broken down for transportation. So this is the mock-up process. Actually, there's our install and putting it together. This is the sort of armature to receive all the components that we arrived to, and all of the panels that we had. I mean, there's plenty more with the sampling. And the first steps for us were just to drill the panels out and epoxy in some threaded rods for attachment, which would likely be at least one way that these would be hung from a ceiling if we were to go forward with this. And I will say that my understanding of terracotta was definitely incorrect as we got to it, because I really had no sense of how durable, how hardy these things were until we started to drill them out and put the pins in them. This is quick time-lapse video of placing the pieces. So the main panels went in pretty quickly, no, not that quick. But the coin panels and the sort of L-shaped striated panels required some adjustment as we went forward. This is just an image of how larger panels might be ganged to smaller fragmented panels as they reach the edge of an ellipse, just kind of or are interrupted by a harder structure. Isaac and Alex putting one of the panels in. Mitch keeping a watchful eye on us here. and then some adjustments to some of the panels just to get them to fit. A quick sketch of sort of on the fly adjustment in order to get the corner panel that Dan's putting in on the right hand side. And then finally some detail shots of the panels. I had left at this point, but as the mock-up was finished, the light was sort of streaking through the skylight and in the assembly space, and the guys pushed it over and took some quick photos of it. Although it would never be seen with this much contrasting light, you can imagine how it might respond in a vertical application. And that's the final. That's it.
Super. Thank you, guys. That was great. What I wanted to maybe just start exploring a little bit now that you had your hands-on experience with the terracotta. Obviously, a lot of the production was happening with Andy remotely, and you guys were getting some kind of feedback. I'm sort of interested more in the exploring of just how your thinking changed during the design process in terms of that engagement. Because initially, I think a lot of the models you were making, for instance, the leather and others, were just kind of a certain feeling that you wanted to impart. And then, of course, you start seeing what begins to happen with that. Could you maybe speak a little bit or expand a little bit more about the dialogue? What are the kind of dialogues are you having, or the frustrations I imagine you're having also as you're thinking through this process?
I think a lot of the dialogues were happening internally, but also across with Andy in trying to exaggerate a particular texture. I mean, the one that really sort of sticks in my head is with the hexagonal panels. We started with a sort of single depression, thinking about what scale was right. The scale of the depression was right relative to the scale of the panel on the whole. And so there was that constant sort of back and forth between both trying to get the scale right, but then also not really have a repeat, and have a texture that felt right at the height that it was, around 14 feet, I guess, away from the viewer, and still feel like, you know, as Mitchell said, something that you want to take a bite out of. You know, I mean, I think, you know, there's the image that Todd and Billy showed of the child sort of touching the panels, and we wanted to have that sort of tactile nature to it, and the desire to actually want to go up and touch it, although not it's too far away. But there are some panels that have that, the ability to be brushed against and felt, and I think that's part of the dialogue that we were having as well.
Yeah, this is Isaac. Can you hear me? I'm remote at the moment.
Sure, Isaac,
but
go ahead.
One other thing I wanted to mention too was the iterative process with Andy, getting samples almost every week and testing them in the office, looking at them in different lighting conditions, and also just understanding the scale of the texture, directly with the material, and also getting feedback from other people in the office too. It wasn't just the four of us, looking at these pieces. And so I think that was really crucial to the development of the terracotta. And I think there are many more samples that we didn't show for color, for the application of the engobe and its effect with various glazes. And so those were, I think, really, really useful in learning about the terracotta and what it does, how it reacts. I think that was the most, useful process with Andy, was that back and forth.
And so much of that process was a combination of defining the base clay texture and then how each of the different glazes actually pools or is shadowed as he sprays, because all the glazes were sprayed. So each of the surface would receive the glaze entirely different. And it wasn't really until we got the samples in person that we could see how complex each of the glazes were in relation to these surfaces. And even just, we had samples on the final samples, but it wasn't really until I spent 2 days actually hanging these pieces that I understood the complexities of kind of these glazes at a really small scale.
Super. Well, thank you guys so much. It was wonderful having you as part of ACAW, and we look forward to sort of collecting your work in the book that will follow. The glazes were wonderful, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit from Andy in terms of that at the end of the conference.
And thanks to you, Omar, I mean, and Boston Valley and the ACAW team. I mean, this has been very an eye-opening experience, I think, for all of us, and one that we'll look back to. It's been extraordinary. Thank you.